Hello, greetings, welcome to the Segue reading series. We're glad you're here. We have gathered to hear from Su Henriksen and Celina Su. My name is Lonely Christopher. I'm an editor for Roof Books. And I'm going to go ahead and start the introduction for Laura. We're super excited to have sort of advanced copies of Laura's book, but it sold out immediately. I watched it happen. So if you don't have one, okay, apparently maybe see Stephen after the reading, or Laura. So here we go. Laura can't believe her luck. Laura's desires are insatiable. Laura is a dreamer. Laura fantasizes about going on vacation and getting fucked on the beach. There are a series of men and women, all coming for Laura. We are living inside of Laura's debauched reveries. Her pleasure is operatic and written all over her face. It is because she is a character in a porno. Laura is a poster on the wall, advertising an old German sex flick titled Laura's Desires. The ticket taker outside the Variety movie house promises that, quote, "The most beautiful woman of your dreams is on my screen," unquote. Laura is waiting for you up there. She's flat, but she's loud. Christine really needs a job. Luckily, she lives in New York during a period when people went inside to take smoke breaks. So instead of formatting her resume with ChatGPT and revamping her LinkedIn account, Nan Goldin recommends her for a gig at the box office of a dirty theater. It ain't glamorous, but for Christine, it wards off an undesired return to, quote, "the phantom Michigan from which her mother calls," unquote. Christine is a character in a 1983 movie called Variety, which was directed by Betty Gordon and inhabits an intermediate space between the unfinished project Downtown 81 and Scorsese's slightly later and more commercialized Soho romp After Hours. The cast of Variety features Luis Guzman, Nan Goldin, with cameos from Cookie Mueller and Spalding Gray as an obscene phone caller. The jazzy soundtrack is by John Laurie. The screenwriter is none other than Kathy Acker, a writer whose reputation has lately developed from underground sensation to academic cottage industry. This is partially the subject of Su Henriksen's new book, Laura's Desires, forthcoming from Nightboat. Dream, Dream, Dream is a dream piece about dreaming. And Laura's Desires is about Laura's desires. There's Christine and the movie she's in. She sits behind her counter and sells tickets to the show. She wanders around the city, the gritty infrastructure of these purveyors of cheap fantasy. Dinner in a parked car, an open carton of Chinese takeout fogging up the windshield, a marquee advertising Malcolm McDowell in Caligula, a depressing ferry terminal. The city is in a state of gorgeous desolation, which I romanticize from a safe distance, but which underlines what the poet calls, quote, "the cruel absurdity of being anywhere," unquote. Henriksen writes that through her feminine gaze, Christine is, quote, "transgressing various all-male sanctuaries like sex stores, porn theaters, and the Fulton Street Fish Market. You know the drill. Women laboring in exploitative commercial spaces designed for the sexual gratification of men, but Christine seems to be interpreting her surroundings rather than being oppressed by them. She takes a break from the box office and snoops around the theater to a soundtrack of performative moans. An older mafioso type who frequents the cinema starts flirting with her and takes her out to a ball game. Despite his obvious criminality, he's non-threatening to her, but instead of letting her guard down and following a courtship script, she starts stalking this man, subverting the conventional power dynamics. She sees him holding a briefcase and shaking a lot of hands. She follows him out of town, breaks into his motel room, and steals his porn. Henriksen addresses the narrative disruptions of Laura's Desires, which avoids full penetration in lieu of poetic and pornographic description, unfurling in Christine's dreamlike monologues delivered to disinterested or affronted men. The poet comments, quote, "Let fucking be non-teleological, but if it must be towards something, then let it be nothing, not reproduction, not even orgasm, but the temporary abdication of the numb despotism of being anyone at all," unquote. In the economy of what used to be called the deuce, now unrecognizably Disney-fied, sex is both, quote, deferred and permeating everything, unquote. Henriksen tells us that the Variety Theater wasn't actually in Times Square, as somebody my age might assume, but downtown near the Poetry Project. Laura's Desires, the book, not the movie, is hybrid, intertextual, investigative, essayistic, historical, ekphrastic, memoiristic, and a bunch of other things, quote, splashing in the bathwater between life and myth-making, unquote. Watching Variety for the first time and then immediately reading Laura's Desires was like experiencing an avant-garde classic with an extremely enriched commentary track. Henriksen addresses the genesis of the cinematic project, unearthing that, quote, Betty Gordon's then boyfriend Tim Burns was curating a show at Artist Space called Emergency to address the rapid disappearance of funding from the buckling NEA. For the show, he gave a number of filmmakers $75 to make a movie. Betty was one of them, and she made Anybody's Woman, which ended up being basically a treatment for Variety, unquote. The audience might realize that Artist Space is the very institution we currently inhabit, although relocated like many things that have survived. The poet performs an expert feminist analysis of the movie. Elsewhere, Henriksen tells us how this thing got made in the sex-phobic and defunded early 80s, even breaking down the film's $80,000 budget, half of which came from German television with $25K from Niska. This is pornography with metatextual frames around it that turns it into something more meaningful than utilitarian, a platform for identity and exploration, as well as pleasure where, quote, the skin made of colored light, unquote, flickers across a blank screen representing our deepest dreams. Christine roams the city not as a location, but a condition, her demeanor developing from indifference to curiosity to reclaimed pleasure. Her bothersome boyfriend's prudishness doesn't penetrate her psyche. Christine is not a character who's, quote, performing her desirability, and she's not interested in coherence, unquote, but she is slowly growing from being a watcher to a participant. She turns a suited suitor into prey and uncovers his shady dealings. She upends the functions of the pornographic space to suit her needs. She changes her look. She reclaims things or takes them for the first time, like the poster for that flick Laura's Desires, which ends up hanging in her apartment. Henriksen labors against the outmoded moralism and essentialism that drove the anti-pornography movement within feminist discourse and creates a fresh reading of an underappreciated treasure of downtown filmmaking, which resonates perfectly with its subject. After all, the acronym WAP used to stand for Women Against Pornography, but these days we know it means wet ass pussy. In the end, Christine propositions the older man, who first came on to her, asking him to see her on her terms, confident and maybe a little blackmaily. The film concludes on a shot of the intersection where they're supposed to meet, and it's empty, but buzzing with possibility. Did the rendezvous already take place? Is it about to happen? Or have they both ghosted each other? About the ambiguous ending, Henriksen surmises, quote, I'm being asked to not know and to deal with that unknowing, unquote. Know this, Laura Henriksen is the program director at the Poetry Project and teaches at the Pratt Institute. Laura's Desires is her first book, to which the audience has early access tonight. Please welcome to the Segue reading series, Laura Henriksen.
One of the things that I was most excited about was the prospect of getting an introduction from Lonely Christopher that was so beautiful and honored me so deeply. Thank you. And thank you all so much for being here. I feel so lucky and so grateful. I went to Kimberly Alidio's great launch maybe a couple of months ago, and she talked about how you could tell it was the launch because she did the extended thank you to everyone, and this is not the launch. So even though there are many, many people to thank, I will keep this part brief and just say how deeply honored and humbled I feel to get to read from this book, published by Nightboat, a press that is my dream, that has changed my life many times with the books that they've put out, and to read also here at Segue, this community institution that has been a central part of my creative life and my social life for over a decade, and how much it means to me that both of those places have committed to PACB, which is just something that I feel is so deserves to be celebrated. It's been, I have, as do all of us, so many feelings, and one of them is a real profound pride to be a poet in a poetry community that is so abundantly full of people who, without hesitation and with great courage, responded to this moment that urgently demands our solidarity with Palestine in a way that I find that gives me so much strength. So thank you all so much. I'm so in love with being in community with you. And I'm so excited to get to share this book with you, which is just, I can't believe that I'm holding it. I was like so excited to put little sticky notes in this book that I'm reading from the beginning of the poem. I did not need to put a sticky note there. But I'll read a bit from the beginning of Laura's Desires. The problem of Betty Gordon's 1983 film Variety is economic. Christine needs a job so she can avoid returning to the phantom Michigan from which her mother calls. The movie opens with Christine by a swimming pool, the water audible but just out of frame, her hair held by a yellow swim cap. She turns around, looks at a clock on the wall, wonders if she has enough time, how much she should rush, but then she's already here, so might as well try. The cruel absurdity of being anywhere, the persistent absence of an alternative, the restless water. She dives in, swims across, flips over, returns, this time on her back. Her arms complete circles we can only half see. Her thighs break and restore the surface of the pool. A close-up of her stomach under her striped red suit. The way the camera isolates her body in fragments refracted by the pool's surface both creates and disrupts the sense of witnessing a display. Afterwards, in the locker room, she asks her friend for lipstick and disappears, returning from the wrong direction. We had seen her before in a mirror. Now we see her in the frame. She moves again, and we get both. If the camera shifted slightly, it would enter the picture reflected, and another Christine would appear, inverted on the lens. I have never liked going to the gym with others, although I really like the gym itself. It's not a matter of privacy, it's more because one of the ways my gender informs my behavior is that I always feel like a host, with duties to attend to by making my warmth, which is sincere, more immediately perceptible to others in a way that might provide some ease against the strain of being a person in public, while also appearing so natural as to hardly register. It's sometimes fun and other times exhausting, and so a lot of what I do I need to do alone or with someone who I know wants nothing else. But Christine, played by Sandy McLeod, and her friend do want something from each other. They want not to be alone in the brutal early evening, and also Christine needs a job. Her friend, Nan, played by Nan Golden, is trying to help her in this pursuit, the trap of labor, the threat of return. Christine wants to be a writer, but she needs money. They list out options while pulling on their sweaters against the thick air, but nothing is viable. There are no copy editing gigs, people wait in line to work at failing department stores. Finally, Nan, with great reservation, mentions an opening at Variety, a Times Square porn theater. Nan worries Christine is not the type for it, but Christine is more worried about her bounced rent check. In the next scene, we see her in Variety's window box between the lobby and the street selling tickets for $2. Variety Photoplays was a real place, however, not in Times Square. The real Variety was down on 3rd Avenue between 13th and 14th Streets, right around the corner from my job now. The theater isn't there anymore, though at first I read the address wrong and thought of another theater I have loved a block further south, where I've stolen blue slushies after spending afternoons beneath well-funded disasters. I'd look out the tall windows of the vacant second-floor lobby, not yet ready to leave, thinking about people and what people might think about me, snow falling on parked cars, trash bags tripping aimless pedestrians. Variety, which operated from 1897 to 2004, was demolished after its closure, replaced by a glass high-rise where life, which once had so richly stained the seats, is now unimaginable. In 1984, a year before Variety's general release, a writer for Bright Lights Film Journal described visiting the theater and finding the film playing upside down, which no one in the audience appeared to mind, searching and stirring around in the dark from their seats to the lobby to the bathroom, which was located in the front of the theater behind the screen. Upside down, the movie rolled on, flesh-filled and weightless. The journalist said the walls were nothing special, but the ceiling was covered in a beautifully patterned tin that had somehow lasted all those years as glittering teeth in the dark. He called it a time capsule. If movies are attempts to freeze moments, transforming events into repeatable, rearrangeable units, then shouldn't their palaces also take part in this pursuit? All such efforts are doomed. I wonder what kind of candy the workers sold at porn theaters to make the day more sweet, already good as night. In Variety the movie, there is a soda fountain, but no candy I can recall. Once in youth, a boy poured Diet Coke over his cock so it would be sweeter when I sucked it. I was touched by the gesture, if also a bit concerned, as Coke can be pretty corrosive, but it wasn't there for long. Eventually, everyone needs a woman to appear at a distance and burn like science fiction's distant cities, with medical training and the memory of 6 or 7 summers on the water, draped in silver from the hidden filth of icicles, receiving confession with the clerk's disinterest, a stingray on the floor of the ocean, dawn's hardest blue, walking backwards from a station fixed by nothing but the firmament of her anger won in chaos, to stand in her silence like a vandal at the crypt, in love with its marble. We follow Christine as she becomes increasingly embedded in the social world of the theater, moving around the neighboring bars and adult bookstores that operate in an economy driven primarily by sex work. One habit she develops is to narrate pornographic scenes in a dispassionate, almost trance-like state to her boyfriend, Mark, who cannot hang. In one of my favorite scenes, they sit in his car eating Chinese food with forks straight from an assortment of paper cartons. They're talking about his job. He's a journalist trying to expose some racketeers he's become obsessed with, enchanted by the power he perceives as ill-begotten, power that he longs to dismantle and, in so doing, establish new power for himself. There are noodles on his face. He explains to his bored girlfriend that if he has to disclose his sources, that will be a whole other story, and Christine repeats the phrase, other story, slow, as if she's trying to read a water-damaged sign from across a dark room. Other story, stories, smooth skin, until eventually the story becomes a black slip on a woman's body as she paces before a man in an armchair stroking his cock. She gets on her knees, she kisses him, she pushes him away, she pulls up her slip, she's down on all fours, the fabric brushes her breasts as she breathes. Christine describes her shoes, her ass, the way she opens up. Kathy Acker wrote Variety's script based on a story by Betty Gordon, and in the porn monologues in particular, you can really feel her. Christine's boyfriend, dejected, stares into the lo mein until he can't take it anymore. He asks if she's okay. She looks confused. I'm just trying to tell you about my life. She wants to be a writer. She's in her boyfriend's parked car writing her life. It's interesting. One big critique of the movie at the time was that it didn't have enough sex in it. It wasn't pornographic enough. It was a tease. This betrays the underlying assumption that porn has to be visual, something you watch. And so all the scenes where Christine narrates erotic encounters are just what? Not pornography, or worse, unsatisfying pornography. It's funny to me these critics don't recognize their twin in Mark, sitting there useless, unwilling or unable to receive what Christine is offering. Sometimes I wonder if I even like writing. It's so difficult, and so rarely do I say what I mean, but then what's likable about anything under the patriarchy? Leo Bersani writes that most people don't really like sex, even if they still feel the need to have it. Bersani was making this argument from the same deadly 1980s as Variety, in an essay examining the anti-sex rhetoric of the conservative right, gleeful conductors of the mass death of the AIDS crisis, shaking their heads on television as they talked and didn't talk about anal sex, and also of the radical feminists of that era in fervent crusade against pornography, which to them was the same as rape, a category under which, according to their logic of domination, all fucking fell, as all fucking remained subject to the tyranny of penetration, its absolute power turning any cavity into a vacuum, a void. Of these feminists, Bersani writes, their indictment of sex, their refusal to prettify it, to romanticize it, to maintain that fucking has anything to do with community or love, has had the immeasurably desirable effect of publicizing, of lucidly laying out for us the inestimable value of sex, at least in certain of its ineradicable aspects, anti-communal, anti-egalitarian, anti-nurturing, anti-loving, unquote. The problem, according to Bersani, is not that the self is fucked into annihilation, nor is it the loss of self-control, of power over the self and the world beyond the self. Instead, what needs to be challenged is the inherent devaluing of powerlessness on which rests this anti-sex argument. Let fucking be non-teleological, but if it must be towards something, then let it be towards nothing, not reproduction, not even orgasm, but the temporary abdication of the numb despotism of being anyone at all. I return to this essay often and try to imagine the contours of the world such world-ending sex makes possible. The fantasy of an endless fall, illit grace, plants that smell sour as I ferment myself, hurling chunks of the forest floor into the ambulance like, first let me gather a few of my things. When I think about what it means to me to be contained in the category of women, I think first about penetration, which is not to suggest that this is the unifying experience of this category, or that this is an experience exclusive to this category, or that this category exists beyond its imposition, not an origin of anything, just the most important part to me, by which perhaps I simply mean my favorite. Very early in our relationship, Morgan and I went camping. A friend had asked me to read in a trolley adjacent to an experimental music festival, headlined by artists I was mostly unfamiliar with, since I pretty much just listened to pop music and rap. A friend or two advised me not to bring him on the trip, not to take things too fast. I was experiencing a period in my life where I found myself the recipient of a lot of advice, which I appreciated, as I appreciate any gesture of love, but nevertheless consistently ignored, so I could instead be gilded by an internal trail of chaos. It wasn't that I thought I knew better. I was very aware that I didn't know anything, but my behavior remained just outside of my conscious control, and I kept making choices I found surprising, as if my agency had an agency of its own. It wasn't a dissociated feeling of watching from a distance my own actions, but it did have certain qualities similar to being a viewer, curious to see what events might unfold, without any particular predictions. I wish I could say it was a form of non-attachment, since I aspire to that kind of openness, but desire animated every move I stumbled through, a diffuse and cloudy light. So Morgan rented a car and we went camping. It felt like a teenager's fantasy of adulthood's promised liberties, without the drag of adulthood's disappointing responsibilities. The day after the reading, we drove to a trailhead. It wasn't so much hiking as walking slowly across something comparable to mud, but more buoyant, like a pile of moss blankets on the softest part of the earth's belly, so that with every step I felt both sucked down and repelled away, suspended. I guess it was a marsh. I felt my legs' effort to carry my weight in a simultaneous lightness. The trail culminated in a lighthouse, and when we made it, we saw that it didn't have a tower, such as is commonly associated with lighthouses, but it did have the other parts. The house, a very bright bulb. We looked at the water and took a picture together that I sent to my mom. On the walk back to the car, the water had risen, approaching closer to our path, and the sky had gotten farther away. Often when we have sex, I have the sense that I'm of the same material as the earth on that day, like the handprint left on a mattress in an ad for memory foam just before it slowly disappears, as if instead of being subject to the force of gravity, I am its very center, the wet dirt holding all the weight there is to hold in a precarious balance. A lot of singers compare pussies to lakes, which is apt, not just for the wetness, but for the liveliness of lakes, so mysterious, delicate, overwhelming. The seam on God's wallet, asleep on the couch and dreaming an apocalypse with the volume of snow. It is not possible to be at home in this world and there's nowhere else to go. Is there any joy but in the ardent exercise of futility? Well, yes. There's poetry, there's making friends, watching movies, sex, but that's all part of the same practiced impermanence. Haunted by spectral goodness, like goodness will feed you if you're trying to be fed. It was formed from the start in proximity to you, the fountain the architect dreamed. The children used to organize the hierarchy of longing in the tumult of their callous society. It's the same as peeling without puncturing stone fruits or nightshades. We rushed to the ending and found it abandoned, but as though disuse were the aim all along. I remember being a little drunk in the rented car, Morgan driving us back from the trolley to the tent. I insisted on listening to Car Wheels on a Gravel Road, since we were at that moment driving on a gravel road. Every thought or feeling I ever had converged into a single moment, which is true of all moments, but mostly I forget or fail to notice. Last month, I received as a gift a plastic blue bird feeder that I hung on the fire escape. I worry it might irritate our downstairs neighbors, precipitating as it does such a fresh magnitude of shit on not only our own fire escape, but on those below as well. But then again, our neighbors are polite ex-Texans who haven't complained before when we've been disruptive, and I hope won't start complaining now. Yesterday, there was another gathering, mostly of house sparrows and house finches, proclaiming at the feeder while I sat idly by, not writing, not dying. I looked away, I looked back, and my small companions had been replaced by an American kestrel. I felt afraid, awed by its quiet, and also concerned that it would drop half the sparrow it was tearing apart onto the fire escape below. If it did what I text my neighbors, just hope they wouldn't notice the carnage. I wondered if maybe this meant I should remove the feeder, worrying that I had inadvertently created a trap, but then isn't that always the risk of homemaking? The kestrel was relaxed. the stripes on its back barely moving. I tried not to watch. What remains is a hard beak on the wrought iron, gently unsettling me as I sit at my desk and try to write about what I've seen and other things beyond my power to control or explain or understand. The presence of hawks in our dreams is divine. It heralds freedom and foreshadows loss, also a kind of freedom. I have sometimes seen hawks in times of great emotional activity, because often when I'm happy or when I'm crying, I go to parks, so I may be or do so near a crowd, which is also where city birds of prey go to hunt. Pretend not to, but watch me with your watery public eyes. One difference between voyeurism and fetishistic scopophilia is that the former requires a narrative with subjects and objects acting and being acted upon, and in this way is always approaching sadism. The voyeur's discovery unravels a mystery about the behavior of others, and the resolution to any mystery includes someone's punishment, the guilty party exposed, the secrets of strangers flooded in stage light. Scopophilia, however, does not require and in fact cannot sustain narrative. Pleasure in looking disrupts the coherence of a story and identity, and instead you are left with a face, a neck, breasts, thighs, and in or from these disentangled parts you have everything. Like narrative, however, this fragmentation is its own violence, a different loss, the body ripped apart for or by the viewer, hated, feared, adored. I learned this by reading Laura Mulvey, tired in a museum on vacation years ago, sitting on a bench surrounded by ancient sculptures, familiarizing myself with the concept of the male gaze, which I imagined as a jewelry box, the kind that plays music when you open it, and the music is traditional narrative cinema, and the ballerina that mechanically spins is a woman's body caught on film, and the box is otherwise empty, too small to hold anything, except one eye, my mouth, a fragment of my face, and its little oval mirror ringed in gold. I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit because I do want to read the wet ass pussy part. The movie, one of its original screenings was at this Barnard Conference on Sexuality in 1982, which was extremely controversial and protested by the anti-sex feminists that we were talking about before, these radical feminists, through their group, Women Against Pornography. And I think it's really, important to remember that these radical feminists are where we get TERFs from. This is what trans-exclusionary radical feminism begins with. And so we're still very much plagued by this anti-sex belief. I also feel elated when I remember that at the time of this writing, WAP does not mean Women Against Pornography, it means wet ass pussy, thanks to the intervention of artists Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B. The summer of its release, their gorgeous and obscene single, WAP, glazed the city with its ubiquity, its looped sample of Frank Ski's 1993 single, Whores in This House, echoing from every car, its litany of directions on where to spit, swallow, drip, blasting from every T-Mobile storefront. It's not like 1982 is pure speculative memory or anything, it's still present. And so the response to WAP, of course, also included some moral terror. Even Snoop Dogg took a break from filming commercials to say some shit about a woman's secret Nile jewel, a remark to which Offset responded with a reminder that it was a good time to shut the fuck up. And while I am charmed by his solid point, it's still so dumb that Offset had to respond at all, like Cardi's public permission to be a slut. Remember when Nicki Minaj's Anaconda came out? Before the video dropped, feminists on the internet were so excited about what they perceived as a reclaiming of the objectification that is the foundational premise of Baby Got Back. But when the video was released, suddenly it was like this great betrayal, like Minaj's language had been okay, but her image could not be, as if her body and the bodies of the other dancers were too much, were not right, as if the representation of their physical presence, the choreography of both their desirability and their desire, was excessive, overwhelming, inappropriate, unacceptable, bad politics. And Minaj was accused of reinforcing the objectification of women by performing and marketing it herself, a woman. It was, once again, some white feminist puritanical bullshit. The impulse to punish and silence a song or a celebration of desire, the pleasure of a wet-ass pussy, having one or eating one or both or more, remembering that a pussy can, like sex, be whatever the fuck you want it to be, is constitutive to the system of violence against women and absolutely not a way out of it. I don't mean to suggest that all desire is liberatory, and I too am troubled by the ways women are expected to perform their desirability as well as their desire in public to accumulate a certain kind of adulterated cultural power. I just want to offer that a strong reaction of fear or rage in response to that performance says a lot more about the person experiencing fear and rage than it does about the person or people or artifact that fear and rage is directed against, such as Megan argues so persuasively in her music video for Thought Shit. This is part of what I think the Barnard Conference was hoping to address in asking about the status of pleasure, and asking not just what sexuality is, but what sex is. I feel a deep appreciation for the question on the possibility of evading valuation totally. I mean, even here, when I'm like, what if we stopped devaluing powerlessness? What if we stopped devaluing doubt? And by we, I mean, of course, am I not just offering an alternative model of valuation? What do I do when I'm not evaluating? On the car ride back from meeting Morgan's grandmother, I remember he and I talked about my anxieties and fears around being in an open relationship, my unfortunate capacity for, even tendency towards jealousy. Then I was quiet for a while, passing trees and ditches and medians, and then we talked about the possibility of a language that would emerge singular and specific to each new encounter, a way to escape the tyranny of identification through static categorization, a fundamental instability that would demand a different level of collective responsibility for words, but would also perhaps offer a transformative liberation of meaning making, and so also the world, which is made of meaning. We got candy and coffee at a rest stop, and I felt the hot possibility of balance between total resolve and an unfixed and endless unresolution. It was early January, and I was so brave, if gasping between waves can be said to be brave. I wonder still about this desire to valorize doubt. Doubt has this amazing way of tricking the person holding it into faith in something else, an underlying assumption that is the base from which it's possible to doubt other things. I mean, think about Descartes. Out here like whatsoever can be doubted will be doubted, and then relying on the most egregious assumptions about what thinking means, claiming to upend everything, but instead replicating and naturalizing the same dominant structures and arguing that it all makes sense now. Fanny Howe writes, doubt has a lot in common with infinity, being boundless, and the authority of what is presented as truthful may be more unsettling than what remains a conjecture, unquote. And she is such a believer. But she's a believer in the kind of way that makes proof impossible, undesirable, outside the world of meaningful reference. I wonder if doubting is something I can barely even do, a precarious suspension I can only maintain in fleeting starts, since it pushes me outside of words available to describe the things I'm so sure of, even if it's negative certainty, like knowing when something is definitely not true. So that more than a concept, doubt is a feeling, past a vague, I wonder if it shouldn't be this way, and more towards, maybe it isn't this way at all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. That was incredible. Now, I invite you to take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back with Celina Su. Hi, welcome back. So, my name is James Sherry, and I'm here to introduce Celina Su. I've been fascinated by her poetry since we read together earlier this year. So I asked her to read for us today. The fact that a professor of urban studies and political science is also a poet pleases the practical arrays and imaginative/linguistics so conflict that I long to see how they blend in Celina Su's poetry. For example, this quatrain: not spirit animals, nor zodiac signs, but labels or libel amidst dogs, cockroaches, pigs, locusts, and vigilante lion birds. I sing alongside Dig Ill and read Linden Chai on discussion forums. I attempt to grasp hands and feet. This is one answer to my question. She uses the techniques of poetry, repetition, lists, and disjunctive detail to speak of the applied behavior that even poets confront daily. The attempt to grasp hands and feet, to feel the fleeting in the flesh, seems good practice for a poet. The second question is whether the work holds up with these hybrids of fact and fancy. In fact, the building of cities is as absurd as any poet could imagine. The creation of states turns out to be the perfect theme for her poem. Quote, if from my ashes surreptitiously scattered in the park, dumped into a sound for an ocean, Czechoslovakians might be born, we could then possibly transcend, finally, nation states on our paper holograms. And then, how do these different identities make her feel? In her poem, How to Wean, she says, I attempt to ask smart questions, though I am confident, fairly, that I haven't articulated a thought coherent since late 2017. Her skill to reverse time as our thoughts in it point freely forward and backward, even as time only goes forward, engages a world well inhabited, like a city of the mind, which I'd posit among the bodies and nations she calls, is her true address. Please give a warm welcome to Celina Su.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm not sure I've ever had one before that really took seriously my work in politics and my poetry. So that it's such an honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm so excited to have gotten to hear you, Laura. Thank you all for being here. Partly because of the line, the rest is water, I decided to read a piece about water. I hadn't quite decided exactly what to read before. So this one is called Apparition of a Pond, and it's a longish essay. My other pieces will be probably shorter, about the New York City water system. Apparition of a pond, that I should constantly thirst for its reflection and refraction, that I should turn on the tap and worry perhaps about my building's old pipes, but not about the water itself, that I feel not miles by dimensions away from the horrors of Flint, of Baltimore. In my mind's eye, a line of women carrying tubs of water atop their heads just outside of the car. I had thought that the tea bouillon in the restaurants had been much too expensive to correspond with the lack of basic infrastructure. That this is not true. There's lead in the soil at Prospect Park and the water fountains of Brooklyn College. We too are steeped in failed governance. To me, to take after water, to reflect on water, demands that I, first, confront my own reflection, our subjectivities, your changing forms, our political economic contexts, that I attempt to do this on fraught land, from within empire, its many layered permutations, from within the empire state, unceded Lenape-Canarsie land. When the Dutch arrived in 1609, this island was surrounded by salt water. It boasted of 24 streams and 4 ponds. Wolves, bears, mountain lions, 70 kinds of trees, 30 kinds of orchid lived here. Broad Street, Maiden Lane, Minetta Street, and 6th Avenue consisted of freshwater. Central Park and Times Square were prominent beaver colonies. There were, of course, lots of beavers on Beaver Street. Before it marked the border between Chinatown and Soho, Canal Street traced the canal. In a hole left by a glacier, water seeped into Collect Pond. Slaughterhouses, tanneries, and breweries dumped their waste into it so that it was heavily polluted, spreading cholera by 1800. By 1821, city officials drained the pond and covered the canal. Paradise Square became 5 Points, a purgatory connecting Chinatown to city courts, the Manhattan Detention Complex, the underworld, the tombs. The apparition of the glacier, of the apparition of the hole, the apparition of the pond, these haunt the tombs. I've recounted this instance before, but it sticks to me, so I'll stick with it. I remember attending a United Nations meeting where an indigenous leader spoke about how official governmental protection of her land was anything but. The government opened up her land, community's land, to oil companies and paramilitary groups. When she went on to talk about intergenerational trauma, the presiding rapporteur interrupted. "Excuse me, but your intervention is not smart." I gasped. It took me a while to realize that the rapporteur meant that her testimony was not SMART as an acronym: specific, measurable, action-oriented, relevant, time-sensitive. Intergenerational traumas are not SMART because they lack a contained shape, because they cannot be addressed by specific individuals we can sue and name as racist, because they are pervasive and seep into our dreams as well as our nightmares. State institutions claim that they are too amorphous. They do not merit attention. What does critical resistance look like for those of us with little institutional, financial, formal power? What would it mean to escape the constraints of institutional shapes and legal containers, to take after water, to use water to recognize trauma, to be so invaluable and ubiquitous as to be taken for granted, to cradle each of us even before we were born in utero? I always forget that in Chinese culture, one is born at age 1 in order to account for our time suspended in amniotic fluid. Even now, nearly half of the Hudson River's waters from here to Troy is considered a precious tidal estuary where salt and fresh waters meet. We became a global city by building along, using, and polluting these waters. That water begins with the deception that it is here to accommodate. It's spineless. It has no memory. What if, even as it's always taking on a different shape, it passes through and retains the memory of experience through its many lives, cycles of evaporation and condensation, as ice, liquid, steam? I want to honor water's memories to the sacrifices of others, human and more than, to drink that gives life to all life, but I hardly know even the basics. Before the city built sewage and water pipe systems, New Yorkers relied on wells that tapped underground streams for drinking water. During the Revolutionary War, British troops destroyed an attempt at a reservoir on the outskirts of the city. In 1835, a fire broke out in New York so massive it was seen from Philadelphia. It took 2 weeks to put out the fire because we lacked water. New Yorkers looked to alternate sources for clean water, ventured 30 minutes north, and found the Croton River. The Croton water system hired mostly Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine to build a reservoir and 41-mile aqueduct to carry its water south. When it was completed in 1842, the city celebrated with a procession 5 miles long. Our water supply is extraordinary, our demand even more so. In 1905, to build up our city's water supply, we flooded towns. Olive, West Shokan, Broadhead's Bridge, Brown Station, building dams, reservoirs, and aqueducts in the Catskills. By the 1930s, our water board moved from the Catskills to the Delaware River and its tributaries. Another 4,000 people were forced to vacate their homes in the towns of Eureka, Arvina, Shavertown, Beerstown, Rock Royal, Neversink, Bittersweet. 2,371 bodies were removed to be reinterred elsewhere. Now we take the waste produced downtown back uptown to the North River Water Pollution Control Plant. As Cecil Corbin Mark of West Harlem Environmental Action quipped, when Robert De Niro flushes his toilet in Tribeca, Harlem has to deal with it. This, despite the fact that the pollution control plant is on higher ground in Hamilton Heights. Meanwhile, the sewage system is supposedly controlled by gravity. Its water is supposed to go down, not up. Given this history, what would it mean to decolonize, to commodify water, to begin to do so here in this city? What would it mean for me to remember even this brief journey each droplet has taken when I turn on a faucet, satiate myself with a sip? Colloquially in Mandarin, Tai Sui Le means too watery or weak. In Thai, it's important to me namjai, to have a watery heart, to be kind, to make sacrifices. In both of these phrases, being watery intimates a sublimation of self. Yet Adrienne Marie Brown exhorts changing is constant, be like water. Rather than being subject to governmentalities, to institutional shapes, are there modes of furtive engagement, to watering down, that it saturates. Humidity exacerbates each extreme ambient condition, a cold damp deep in my bones, a muggy swelter before a thunderstorm. It seeps unassuming, life-giving, life-taking. Whether to believe in a future in the face of the destruction of our earth without being delusional is to embrace purgatory, to continually work towards real utopias amidst the dystopian. To take after water is to subvert rational choice theory, logics whereby resources become valuable only as they disappear. As Brown writes, water seeks scale, that even your tears seek the recognition of community, that we will not all move along the same paths. Loretta Ross writes that if we were to do that, we would be a cult. But if we were to travel in the same direction, but down diverse tributaries and canals and pipes and clouds, then we move, as in we form a movement. Around boulders and rocks, we flow through shape-shifting and navigation more than force. To take after water is to adapt to context, but also thirst for depth, for belonging, for resistance. To believe in cycle after cycle, reincarnation, to imagine extensions of ourselves beyond the horizon. Only underwater does hair breathe, do weeds unfurl, does the eye submerge. Do you? When we are all relations, the future is estuary. I'm going to read a poem. Thank you so much. I'm going to read a poem called An Echolalia that I wrote when my kid was 2 and she was just starting to learn to speak, and she stuttered, but unusually at the ends of words instead of the beginning. And I looked it up, and it's apparently called echolalia, and it's highly unusual. And I'm still learning that whatever she does next is not necessarily a revelation of her true self. Her true self keeps changing, but I'm still learning. Okay, so that's the context of this. An echolalia. When I hear for the very first time all of my prepositions, oh, yeah, what I meant to say was, whether neurological or pathological, whether or stuttering, for her repetitions do not insist at the beginnings of her utterances. Rather, her speech does not end, especially when the last consonant sounds a voiceless, unaspirated stop. I read bilabial, alveolar, velar. She exclaims, "The lion is wet." T, 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 t. When I obsessed over my inheritance, what have I inherited? My teenage self ruminated over linguistic barriers, dish rags in lieu of paper towels, sickness as sin, that I caught a cold because I left for school with my hair still damp, the absence of an allowance, the lack, the excess, the accented, name calling, kneeling in front of a wall, a temper and impatience, what I deserved. When just a few weeks ago she did not fall, she was always falling. All action in media res, present participling. But last week she falled, and I finded, so that my actions holded no exceptions to the rule. So that I was caught off guard when, yesterday, I bumped into her stuffed animal toys, and she claimed and exclaimed that they fell, that I fell them, that is, that I made them fall, that I felled them. Between fluency and disfluency, between simple and progressive timelines, between her stuffed baby bear and the musical hippo, between a language and a dialect, an army of tanks, a flock of naval warships, a murder of central banks, a convocation of teachers, an array of bureaucrats. When our neighbors compliment her outfit on the sidewalk and she stares at them in return, when 3 minutes and 1 block later, she whispers a reply, wishes them a happy day. Her toddling l'esprit d'escalier, to command a final word. But just now I realize that her echolalia is gone after months of disfluency, or perhaps it has wandered off or taken a turn. Instead, when I reach out towards her, feign an attempt to tickle her, she sings songs, "Don't touch my belly, 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 button, button my jacket." If there is no excess memory, only managed, if I have now forgotten to either seethe over or dwell in my inheritance, my reflection in the mirror looks familiar enough and my surroundings remain the same. Yet, and I blink twice to make sure, it is as if I am walking beside myself along the person I thought I was, have been. Perhaps in the middle of the night, I instructed myself to wake up and navigate my day swiveled a few degrees to the left. My obsessions shift from those of a descendant to those of an ancestor. This, like death, a shock of the sudden forever, sits down upon my chest. When the breath continues, when we exhale and utter, to bequeath, each action I make to reverberate through 7 generations, I will fall, perhaps in or into a future imperfect that she articulates, not a manufactured memory, but a sensation, a theory of whose past. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to read a couple of poems about maps because people know people who know me know I'm obsessed with them. This one is called Trap Streets, and these are streets that map makers got put into maps to catch people plagiarizing. But in the courts, sometimes they become real because businesses name themselves after them, and then they become real. Trap streets. A map is not the territory, but it becomes so over time. Just north of Roscoe, New York, the cartographers Otto G. Lindbergh and an assistant, Ernest Alpers, named the town of Agloe after an anagram of their initials. Rand McNally subsequently included their fantasy town in its roadmaps too, its company surveyors clearly copying and pasting, too motionless to plot the area themselves. But the non-existence of the town of Agloe, the courts deemed, is a non-copyrightable fact. Finders keepers, they begged, and we mixed our labor with the soil. It was too late. The local Exxon was only too keen on naming itself after this fantastical place at the intersection of Highway 206 and Morton Hill Road. We lay down these lines in green as camouflage to catch others in the act of mimicry. These two essences of blending in labor, in yearning, in naming our new little bodega after what we read in books, coloring just outside the lines. We meant it only as a quirk, a splash of color, a tribute to an old flame, our fingerprints, our football rivalries, our silent aspirations. But our most personal rituals and customs become codified on customs forms. Our duty-bound friendships and ecologies of care duty-free only in liquor shops at the border. To become legible, he whispered, is to be tamed into a taxable animal. A state of emergency is no exception. This law envelops us in its warm, soft statutes, looking out onto the horizon for the there. But New Caledonia appears only on Google Earth, despite Captain James Cook's claims. Its longitude and latitude warn us of volcanoes, of Tonga, of what we claim to know. I'm going to read another one about maps. This one is called Desire Lines. And these are the lines that you make by walking. And so sometimes urban planners will wait until a snowfall and see where people take paths. And supposedly it takes as few as 7 people to create a path through grass, for instance. To imagine what I would, as if I could move beyond paranoid deconstruction of the city in which I live, of its decapitation of hills, leveling, to build holloways, to cut fences with precision pliers, to bushwhack, to scramble the rocks, to find a new way to the pond's edge. After snowfall, the existing paths are invisible, the street noise white. I listen to my now innocent heart murmur, transcribe each pump, a washy cymbal sounding off an excess beat of oxygenated blood whooshing back with a slow step, snow crunching underfoot. I look at my footprints, I photograph them with my phone. I try to connect the dots of my treads, speculate the shape of my disobedience. The shortest days cast the longest shadows, my double trailing far behind me in the early afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Celina, and that is a wrap on the Segue reading series for 2023. So we wish you all happy holidays, and we hope to see you back here in January. Roof Books is going to continue for another month curating. January 6th, Tyrone Williams and Pierre Jory. And let's hear it once more for Su Henriksen and Celina Su.